Hi everyone, my name is Ken Reed. I'm a Vice President here at System Improvement, and we're going to talk a little bit about assumptions and how assumptions can cause your investigations to go down rabbit holes, to go in the wrong direction, and just generally come up with the wrong answers. So before we get too deep into this, I probably ought to define what I consider to be an assumption. An assumption is when you are looking at an event or an incident or a problem and you don't collect all the data that you need. You are using your own internal biases, and these are what the assumptions are that we're going to be talking about a little bit today. So why do we see assumptions all the time? Why are they so prevalent throughout most types of investigations? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first thing I want to mention is that as investigators, we think we know everything. And that's not our fault. That is a normal human bias. That's just how we are as people. We just think we know things. We think we're the best at things. We think we know all the data. It's just the way humans are. And it's hard to get out of that type of bias. It's just built into us a little bit. A lot of times, the reasons these biases are out there and these assumptions are out there is because we don't ask the right questions. We think we know the questions that need to be asked. We ask those questions, and then we don't ask the rest of the questions. The questions that we ask are normally those questions we are familiar with. It's the things that we consider ourselves experts in. So as a training guy, I'm probably going to ask all kinds of training problems about the issue that we're investigating. And that's because I'm comfortable with that. I consider myself an expert on training, and I can ask really good questions on that. But because I don't know the other stuff that I'm not an expert on, I'm not going to ask any questions on that. Another reason that assumptions oftentimes show up at a lot in investigations is because we don't back up the data with evidence. We think we know something. For example, if somebody appears to be tired, well, then we're going to assume he was fatigued, without backing that up with any kind of evidence about his work schedule, about the amount of time on and time off this person may have had. So again, we assume that something is true without backing it up with evidence. So how do we avoid some of these assumptions that are out there during our investigations? First of all, you have to make sure you fully understand the problem you're investigating. That may sound obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen investigations that all the proper data has not been collected. It seems so simple. A simple little issue has occurred where somebody sprains their ankle in a parking lot, and we just assume that we know everything about that. And we just ask the guy a couple of questions. So when did you do it? And what time did it happen? And tell me what happened. And that's the extent of our questioning for that kind of investigation. We don't think to go and make sure that we fully understand the problem. One of the ways that we avoid that problem to make sure we do understand everything is we build what we call a snap chart, which is a timeline tool to help us look at every little step in the investigation that we're going to be investigating. And by doing this, by breaking it up into small pieces, we can ensure that we're asking good questions about each one of those little pieces. And it's amazing how easy it is to find holes in your investigation by just making a visual chart of what you're looking at. So building a simple timeline tool, which we use what we call a snap chart, is immensely helpful in ensuring that you're not missing anything and that you're filling all the holes in your investigation. Another thing that we do is as you build that snap chart, I'm not going to say we demand it, but we highly encourage that every piece of data you have on that snap chart is backed up with some kind of evidence. If you are just putting data up there without any kind of hard backup evidence on it, you're going to find yourself going down the assumption direction and down that rabbit hole. So again, it's really important to ensure that every piece of data you throw up on a snap chart that you collect during your investigation is backed up with some kind of evidence to kind of ensure that you're not missing anything. Again, we kind of mentioned what causes the assumptions by not asking the right questions. You have to ask all the right questions. That's one of the things that can very quickly guide you in the wrong direction. And as a matter of fact, it's one of those things that 5 Whys really is one of its faults, one of its weaknesses, is because it doesn't ensure you're asking all the right questions. It's assuming and forcing you to ask different questions, but they're all usually in the same direction. They're not forcing you to go look in other areas. For example, I mentioned if I'm a training guy, my 5 Why investigation is going to ask all kinds of great training questions because that's what I'm going to ask. I'm an expert at that. But I'm not going to ask things about, well, how is the control panel set up and what kind of procedures were out there and what kind of communications were going on between the worker and the supervisor. I'm not going to ask those questions because, well, I'm a training guy, so I'm going to ask training questions. So that is, again, another problem that allows you to have assumptions is not asking all the right questions. And we have several tools to ensure that you're asking all the right questions. We don't want you to miss anything. So even if you're not an expert on human engineering and the design of a control panel, we're going to force you to ask questions about control panel design and make sure that we don't miss any of those possible issues that are just going to be missed if we only go down one specific path. One item that I've heard people say is, well, we're just going to get a bunch of smart people in a room and they're all going to ask and make sure they all ask the right questions. I mean, this sounds wonderful, and I'm not trying to say you don't have smart people at your company, but again, all these smart people are not going to necessarily ensure that they always ask all the right questions. And that's part of the problem with just getting a group together to go interview a person or figure out what they want to look at. You have to have some structured method to ensure you're not missing anything. So that's how to avoid some of those assumptions. Another area that I want to talk a little bit about is what happens while you're gathering data if you do have an assumption, because sometimes you do. When you're, especially at the very, very beginning of your investigation, you may just say, you know what, it was raining outside and it was stormy and the guy slipped. I'll bet you that there was a slippery spot and he stepped in some water and he slipped. Now, that's an assumption. It's a pretty good assumption, by the way, but it is an assumption. So what do I do with that piece of data? I don't just want to throw it out. What I want to do is document that question, that assumption. I'm going to put it, in our case, on the snap chart. We're going to designate that in a certain way with a different color or with a dotted line or something to ensure that we as investigators don't forget about it. It is an assumption. And then I'm going to go test that assumption. I'm going to go out in the field. I'm going to interview the guy. I'm going to look at video records and see if there was a wet spot that the guy stepped in. And if I can see that he had walked through a puddle and slipped and fell at that point, you know what, I think that I can remove that as an assumption. I can write that down as an actual fact. Okay, so nothing wrong with putting assumptions on your snap chart or during your investigation as you gather data. Perfectly okay, but you have to remove those assumptions by the end of your investigation. All right? You need to just gather data and ask good questions. So the two most important pieces of that is that you mark it as an assumption, so everybody knows that's an assumption, and then you go gather some additional data to either support or refute that assumption. Okay? So your goal at the end of your investigation period, or your evidence collection period at least, is to make sure that all your assumptions are gone. That should be your goal, and all you have is facts with evidence to back it up. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is sometimes you're going to be doing an investigation and you are stuck with an assumption. You can't get rid of it. The most common time I see this occur is when, for example, and I'll use this as kind of a worst case, but maybe you had a fatality and the only person that knows the answer to a particular question was the victim. So there is no way that you're actually going to get this data. Okay? So what do you do with that? Well, having an assumption at this point is unavoidable. So that doesn't mean you say, well, I had an assumption, I can't do this investigation, I'm all done. That's not going to work. So you're going to have to work with the assumption. So step one, put the assumption again on your snap chart in your evidence collection and make sure it is documented as an assumption. You want everybody to realize that I am working off of a piece of data that I can't prove. It's probably a really good assumption. You're not going to make bad assumptions in there and just throw stuff out there. So you're going to take the most logical answer and you're going to put it up there and say, I'm going to assume that this occurred. Okay, that's okay. Document it though. Make sure it's circled or put a dotted line around it or a different color. And then you are going to continue with your investigation with that assumption as, I don't want to say as a fact, but as the direction I'm going to go. You don't have a choice. You have to take the best piece of data you've got and just continue from there. Because like I mentioned, the alternative is you just say, well, I give up then. And you're going to miss lots of learning opportunities if you just throw all assumptions out and just stop at that point. So do the best you can. Make the most logical assumption you can, make sure it's documented, and then continue with your investigation. You may find that because of that assumption, there are two different directions I can go. Okay, well, maybe you have to go in both directions then and say, well, because of this assumption, either this happened or this happened. Well, either pick the most likely or take them both and go in both directions, and you're still going to get good learnings out of this investigation, even though I'm not going to be able to 100% prove this. Now, what I just talked about is kind of the edge case. In most cases, when you do investigations, you can eliminate your assumptions. So I don't want you to think that every investigation is going to have some assumption on there that's going to throw you down some weird paths. That's not the case. For most of your investigations, whether it's a quality problem or whether it's a safety problem or an equipment failure, you're going to have evidence that you can use to back up any questions that you have, eliminate those questions, and designate them as facts. So what I had mentioned at the end there is just kind of your worst case. Sometimes that occurs. But in general, remove your assumptions, document them, make sure you know that they're assumptions, go ask some additional questions and collect some additional information, and then either negate or prove that that assumption was true. Okay, so that's what we wanted to talk about today with assumptions. While assumptions can derail your investigation, you can combat that with a structured process that has good questions on it, that has direction you're going to go, and a method of removing those assumptions so that at the end of the day, you end up with some wonderful, really good root causes, corrective actions that can be applied, and hopefully prevent those issues from happening again. Okay, well, that's what I wanted to talk about today. If you'd like to talk a little bit more about this and get a little more personal on it back and forth, first of all, there's some articles that we wrote on this. You can see a link to those down in the description box below and discuss those there. Leave some comments there if you'd like. The same with this particular post here. If you'd like to go and leave some comments below. If you'd like to contact us in any other way, our contact information will also be down in the description box. And don't assume anything from here on out.